Psalm 94. Last time we talked about verse 18 as part of what we talked about. When I said, "My foot is slipping, your unfailing love, Lord, supported me." I could go on and on about the thought of, the concept of God's unfailing love, but I won't. What the psalmist next writes is, well, it's quite interesting to me, and it hits on a very personal aspect of my life's experience. In verse 19, he writes, "When anxiety was great within me, your consolation brought me joy." Anxiety. I think I probably shared this, that after my heart attack, I was prepared for the fact that I would probably experience depression. In my ministry experience up to that point in time, I'd visited lots of people, in fact, in the hospital after a heart procedure of various kinds. And in nearly every case, they experienced a measure of depression in their recovery. So I was prepared for that. And in addition to my experience with people recovering from heart episodes and issues, I also had a history of dealing with depression. Thank God, not clinical in nature, but enough. The depression was real enough and strong enough that it hindered me in, well, almost every way. What I was not prepared for was the anxiety that I experienced. And not just the kind of free-floating anxiety, the generalized anxiety that a lot of people experience. It was full-on anxiety attack. Panic attacks. In fact, on two occasions, I thought I was having another heart attack. Went to the hospital. Last time that this happened was here in Vegas, and I went to the hospital nearest us, or Debbie took me to it, and they held me overnight for observation, and a doctor, what are they called? The doctors at the hospital. Anyway, the doctor came in, a female from, I think, India or Pakistan, one or the other. And the only thing I understood her to say was, "I am not impressed." Well, yeah, well, I was impressed enough that I made my way to the hospital, for crying out loud. I'm so grateful that I have not experienced that intensity of panic anxiety in many years now. I still do, though, struggle with bouts of anxiety. I as a matter of fact, this morning when I woke up, my mind began to spin on anxious thoughts about God's provision. Debbie and I are in a season of our lives where, how do I say it? Our income is not nearly as good as it has been before. It's not as well. It's just more difficult, and the reason it's more difficult is because we're working in a ministry that is completely supported and sustained by people's donations, and we're a little less than half funded. And we're making it because of just God's grace and goodness. But anyway, that just spins. I don't know what, I'd be very surprised if most of us, you that are listening and me, don't have some things that our anxiety returns to. For me, it's provision. There is a message that it's not like a voice I hear, but the message is clear. And it's a lie from Satan, the father of lies. It is the on button for my anxiety. And the phrase is, you're not going to make it. I've thought deeply for a long time about where did that come from. I think best I can, understand it, and the conclusion I've come to is it comes from my childhood. My dad was a preacher, and when I was in grade school, preached at a little bitty church in southwest Kansas that did not pay him enough to support us as family. He worked 3 jobs. And there were times at the dinner table, my mom would, without saying we're not going to make it, she left me with the impression we're not going to make it. Now, here's the thing. We always did. Never missed a meal. We did without some things, but we never didn't make it. Now, I'm 70, and the message still plays. You're not gonna make it. And the twin sibling of that, which is, you're not enough. Not good enough, not smart enough, not fast enough, not strong enough. And as I get older, the list expands. You can't remember well enough. On and on it goes. Things that produce anxiety in us, they have an origin. And the origin is our enemy, the devil. Does God intend for us to carry chronic anxiety? I don't think so. The Apostle Paul in Philippians wrote, "Do not be anxious for anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, present your request to God." Well, now, there's a lot of ways to go with this idea that God is not, it is not his desire or intention that his children would be chronically anxious. I don't think I have to make a bigger case for it. All right, so what do we do about anxiety when it happens? There are people who just basically never feel anxious. This is part of their temperament, and it is truly a gift of God's grace. But for the rest of us, I think the majority of us, well, we get anxious. The psalmist says in verse 19 here, "When anxiety was great within me, your consolation brought me joy." Now, here's something in my experience I can verify, that when I am anxious, it's very difficult. I do not remember a time when I had anxiety and joy at the same time. They exclude one another. When you are anxious, you're not going to be joyful. On the other hand, when you're joyful, you're not going to be anxious. The psalmist writes that God's consolation brought him joy. What is God's consolation? Is it just one thing? I don't believe so. I think God's consolation comes in many different forms. So let's take a minute and think about, what is consolation? What's that? Um, I think of contests where you get a consolation prize, which means thanks for playing, but you lost. Well, consolation is deeply connected to comfort. To be consoled is to be comforted. Consolation is the comforting that God gives us. 2 Corinthians 1, Paul writes that God is the God of all comfort. And he comforts us so that we can comfort others. His consolation comes to us, in my opinion, through grace. God's grace brings consolation. Paul writes at the beginning of all of his letters, except for one, writes grace and peace to you in one form or another. The only time he doesn't do that is in, I believe, 1 Timothy, where he writes grace, mercy, and peace. I think that when anxiety is great, what we want, the outcome we want, is peace, and that's justifiable. That's a good thing to desire. How we get that peace, though, is through God's consolation. And God's consolation comes to us by grace. In fact, I am fully convinced that grace, got a hair on my tongue, that God's grace produces peace. When I am at the top of my game, I'm still going to have anxiety. But when anxiety shows up, anxiety is a lack of peace, and there's all sorts of shades of gray there into black. When I lack peace, what I must do, the only thing that really lastingly works for me, is to revisit grace. God's grace happens daily and minute by minute on some levels, but I miss it. I'm too occupied with, and often I'm so occupied with my own anxiety that I miss God's grace. So this is my challenge. If you, like me, sometimes struggle with anxiety, take a step or two here. First step, get out a notebook or your smartphone or iPad or computer, whatever, but write down a list of when God's grace showed up. When you experience God's grace, write the list. And add to it as things come to you, because I think God's likely to reveal to you over time when his grace showed up. In reflection, you see these things, these times. Write the list. Now, with the list, review it. If you're struggling mightily with anxiety, do this daily. Read the list to yourself out loud. Remind yourself of the goodness of God and the consolation of God. And I'm not going to make this guarantee that you're going to instantly experience joy. But until God's consolation overwhelms my anxiety, I'll never experience joy. So that's my challenge. I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.